This presentation will focus on Unit 1 Writing, and we're looking at the fiction paper for English Language GCSE. It's important that you look at the italicised instructions or information that you're given at the beginning of the paper. You're told that in this particular section you're going to be assessed for your quality of your writing skills. You must remember that for section B, half of the marks are awarded for content and organisation, and the other half of the marks will be awarded for your sentence structure, punctuation and spelling. It's also important to remember that you should be aiming to write about 500 to 600 words, and most students will write about 250 words per one side of A4 writing, depending on the size of your writing obviously. So you're looking to write about 2 sides of A4. One thing to note as well, when you do have half marks for spelling, grammar and punctuation, it's far better that you write a shorter piece that is of good quality rather than writing a longer piece where you're going to have more errors, for example, in your writing as you're rushing to write at length. So just bear that in mind with the weighting with the spelling, grammar and punctuation. You will notice that the word quality is used. By quality, it means not only just the accuracy of your writing, but also your vocabulary choices, the skills that you use, and also the organisation of your writing. It's important that your writing is well structured and that paragraphs link together. Half of the marks are awarded for content and organisation, and those words relate to plot, the characterization, construction, paragraphs, techniques that are used, and also your vocabulary. And remember, that's 50% of your marks. The other 50% of your marks will come from spelling, grammar and punctuation. You should aim to use simple, compound and complex sentences. Try to display a range of punctuation. You should have accurate spelling, and tense agreement should be accurate as well. Just to reiterate the length, you're aiming to write about 2 to 3 sides of your answer booklet, and please don't waste any time counting words. It's just an approximation of the length that you should be writing. You will be given 5 options for your writing. Really important. It may sound silly, but make sure that you only write one story. Don't try to write 5. You'll be surprised how many students sometimes fall into that trap. So it's an either or. So you choose the title that you feel most comfortable writing about. If we look at the first title, write a story which ends. Sometimes you have to be careful what you wish for. Now, if you choose to do that particular title, what you need to be aware of that it demands careful planning of the narrative structure, as you'll always have to end your story in that particular way. The next title, A New Beginning, is a general title that could be applied to many situations. What you must be aware of, though, is to be clear from the start how your narrative relates to the title. The next title is quite a good one to use. Write about an occasion when you had to visit relatives. We often find that students write far better about situations that they have experience of. What you need to do is just leave out the boring details that don't move the story on. Titles that give you the opening sentence can be quite useful to, if you're somebody that needs a starter sentence. They do invite you as well to use flashback, and that might be a structure that for some students they may not feel all that comfortable with. So you need to be very clear about how the story is going to develop. The final title, A Memorable Journey, is another general title, and again, be aware that you can interpret that particular question in a literal or metaphorical way. So it could be a physical journey that you've gone on, or it could be a mental journey where perhaps you've had some kind of progression in your life. So again, it allows you to have that personal experience, which students do tend to write far better about. You will notice that at the end of the story titles, you are advised to use the space below to plan your answer, to plan your work. And the planning is vital. Sometimes students don't feel all that comfortable, they don't enjoy planning because I suppose you go into your exam and you panic and you just want to get started with the writing. But it is very important that you do try to spend 5 to 10 minutes planning how you're going to respond to the essay title that you're going to focus on, because it really gives you a chance to think of your ideas. You don't necessarily have to stick to the plan, but at least it enables you to calm your nerves, to think about characters, and to help you get going. And it's there as a prop, I suppose, as well, whilst you're writing. So, how do you start? The first thing that you need to do is to choose your title. Think about practice narratives that you've written, or the title that gives you a clear idea for your writing. Be aware as well that you can change your mind about the title you want to use during your planning time, but it is so important that once you start going with your story, don't change your mind once you've started writing, because if you do change your mind halfway through writing one particular story, you're going to have a timing issue, and that could be a problem with the marks that you'll be awarded. The other thing to note is, as I've already said, to make sure that you spend about 5 times planning what you're going to write. So we talk about planning. What should you actually plan? The first thing is to keep the time frame narrow for the action of your story. An account of a 10 to 15 minute period is good. You don't necessarily want to write a story where you say 10 years later. Far better that you have a much shorter time frame. You need to think about what will happen at each stage of the story. Go back to those very simple narratives. You may have used story mountains when you were in primary school. That may sound very basic, but at least it's giving you a way to think about a story, a beginning, a middle and an end. What is the point of tension or conflict in the story? How is the tension resolved at the end? And where does the narrative occur? How will you set the scene effectively? And you can think about things like weather, the landscape or environment, any colours or smells or sounds. And then who will be the characters in the story? Really important that you limit the characters to 3 to 4 maximum. I would say actually for 3 characters maximum, because if you have too many characters in your story, you're going to find it very difficult to deal with those particular characters in the narrative, and it could lead you down to lots of dialogue or not really developing characters very effectively, and it is part of the mark scheme. So try to limit it to 3. We're now going to look at an example, and this particular candidate has responded to the title, The Choice. As you read through, you ought to think, what has the candidate done well, and what areas could they improve within the story? You'll notice that there's some colour coding all the way through this exemplar. Anything that's highlighted in green are things to be commended, and anything that is highlighted in red are areas that could be improved upon. No one could begin to imagine what I saw. Flipped tables, scattered bags, and beads of glue dripping from the vast ceiling. There was an infinite noise coming from the 30+ children running in whatever direction suited them. There was no teacher to be seen. I knew I had to do something. From the very beginning, this particular candidate creates this effective scene setting with the phrase, no one could begin to imagine. The reader immediately is interested to find out what this unimaginable scene is. It's about making your reader care about what's happening in the narrative. We also have the use of the first person account, which can be very effective actually for your narrative writing in your exam, and it allows the reader to feel as if they're there with the writer, so it's very good for this empathetic writing. This particular video is thinking very carefully about the vocabulary that is being used. So we have the phrases flipped tables and scattered bags, and that's an area that you should focus on. Think about the vocabulary that you're using to allow yourself to access the higher bands. We have the use of this minor sentence here with beads of glue dripping from the ceiling. What you need to think about is, does that work in that particular, at the beginning as well of the narrative? You will notice in the marking criteria that one of the things that the examiner is looking for is the variation of sentence length. And if you look in this particular example, right from the very beginning, we have this variation of sentence length. So that's going to be, commended quite highly because it is something that is looked for in the mark scheme. Okay, if we move on to the next section. The classroom was enormous, but with 33-year-olds running and crawling everywhere, it didn't feel like. Straight away, there was one child I knew was going to be the troublemaker. His name was Josh. Josh had dark brown hair and hazel eyes. He was the biggest out of all the 3-year-olds and was considerably faster. He'd pushed one of the other kids into the massive sand pit, which catapulted sand into the air. I knew I was going to need some help. One of the areas that is a problem for this particular candidate all the way through this example is commas that are used incorrectly, used in the middle of sentences when they shouldn't be there. Remember that the comma is there for a short pause, and when it's used incorrectly, it's something that we call comma splicing. The effect of comma splicing is to allow it will make your sentences seem very disjointed. So that's something to be very wary of. I always say to students that if in doubt, leave it out. Now, if you don't know where the punctuation mark goes, it's best not to use it at all. But the comma, shouldn't be used randomly in the middle of sentences. So you've got here, the classroom was enormous, but with 30 3-year-olds, you don't need to have a comma in the middle of 30 and 3. So that's inaccurate. The candidate describes the 3-year-olds as running. What you just need to think about it is, could you use more expressive verbs to allow you again to access the higher bands? Remember that one of the things that you're looking at for content and organisation is the use of effective verbs. The phrase straight away sits quite nicely here at the beginning of this sentence because it begins to establish the tension. Characterization allows you to create an impression of a particular character. We do have an example here where Josh had dark brown hair and hazel eyes. It perhaps doesn't tell us a great deal about Josh as a character, but it is an attempt at characterization, so we'll be awarded for it. In contrast to the previous verb running, that I commented perhaps wasn't all that expressive, the use of the verb here, catapulted, is quite an interesting verb choice. Ending the paragraph with the phrase, I knew I was going to need some help, is quite an effective way to end this particular paragraph. It enables the reader to think, well, how could this situation possibly get any worse? Okay, if we look at the next section, I came back to the classroom 5 minutes later, only to find that all the books from all the 6 shelves had been thrown onto the floor and pages had been ripped out of them. Sam started to pick up the books and put them back on the shelves. He was a good friend. I'd known him since year 7. We both decided to come here for our work experience because we thought it would be easy. How wrong we were. Then I decided to start to put all of the bags back away in the cloakroom, because the last thing I wanted to happen was for one of the kids to trip on them and injure themselves. Then my worst nightmare came true. This paragraph begins with I came back to the classroom 5 minutes later only to find. And we would wonder if perhaps this particular sentence would be better to be reworded. Perhaps it could have started with a temporal connective. A temporal connective is a connective, a time connective. So perhaps that would have been better. So 5, for example, might have been better at the start of the sentence. Perhaps it would have worked much better. So from your point of view, it's a real skill to be able to show that you understand when a particular sentence would be better to be reworded. It's quite an important skill to be able to pick that up. In the next sentence, we're introduced to this character of Sam, and it's the first time we've had any reference to this particular character. So who is Sam and where has he come from? There isn't a great deal of characterisation related to that particular character. As the paragraph progresses, we do have this variation of sentences. So where we both decided to come here for our work experience because we thought it would be easy, how wrong we were. So we have this compound sentence and then this very short sentence as well afterwards. So we've got this variation of sentence lengths. Later on in the section, we do have this use of temporal connective at the end with "then my worst nightmare came true." And that's used at the end of this particular paragraph to create tension. The word injure is spelt incorrectly and it's quite a glaring error in this particular section. It's worth at the end of your story checking back through and going over any particular spellings that you're unsure of. There's nothing wrong with putting a line through a spelling and then writing the alternative spelling just above it. You won't get any marks taken off for doing that. So it is very, very important because of the 50% for spelling, grammar and punctuation. It is important that you do check the spellings very carefully. We can see here that as the next section continues, there are lots of errors, and this could be because of a student running out of time, so they start getting a little bit sloppy. So let's read through this section. Sam started to call me. I couldn't make out what he was saying because of all the noise. I heard him call again. As I came into the main room, I could see why he was calling me. So immediately we have the repetition of the word call. And by using the same word repeatedly, what you're not doing is showing that you can use varied vocabulary. There was a gigantic area of the classroom swimming underwater. The source of all this water was coming from the toilets. It was Josh. I knew he was the one who could have caused all of this. As I went into the toilets, I was proved wrong. It wasn't the water Sam was calling me for. It was one of the kids. It was Josh. He was crying on the floor, clutching his left ankle. He'd slipped on the array of water and twisted his ankle, so I carefully picked him up and laid him on the sofa. Then I turned around. We see here an effective verb used in the sentence, there was a gigantic area of the classroom swimming underwater, which works quite nicely in that particular sentence. This sentence, when I read it just a moment ago, I tripped over the words a little bit, and that's because the expression in this particular line is quite clumsy. I knew he was the one could have caused all of this. That doesn't make sense. So it's worth as well reading through your sentences and thinking, well, does that sound right? And if it doesn't, then it's probably because your expression is clumsy, so you need to read back through the sentence and try rewording it. Again, just the line through the sentence, and then with the new sentence written above it or just after it. We talked earlier on in this presentation about comma splicing, and we can see it quite often in this particular section. If I just read it with you, and I'll overemphasise the commas so you can pick up what we mean when we say comma splicing. As I went into the toilets, I was proved wrong. It wasn't the water Sam was calling me for. It was one of the kids. It was Josh. He was crying on the floor, clutching his left ankle. Now, I have overemphasised those pauses, but you can see the effect, hopefully, of what comma splicing does. It makes the writing disjointed when commas are used in the wrong place. If you don't know when to use a comma, then I would always say to you, it should be a slight pause within a sentence, or it could be when you're listing. But if you're really unsure, if you really don't know where to use that particular punctuation mark, don't just put it in. If in doubt, leave it out. So if you're not sure where the comma goes, then just leave it. We have this word here. He had slipped on the array of water, and that particular word doesn't work with water. So think very carefully as well about the vocabulary that you're using and whether it makes sense. Some students use lower cases I, which is incorrect. You must always use, whenever you're referring to yourself, you always use a capital I. And one thing that I always say to my students is to remember that you're important, and because you're important, you use a capital I. So just make sure that you don't use lower cases. It will be quite glaring for the examiner if all the way through your story you're using a lowercase I. So just make sure that you capitalise them. Again, we're seeing spelling errors in this particular section with the laid him on the sofa, which is incorrect. However, as the sentence continues, then I turned around, we have this sense of pace. So those are quite nice phrases that you can use in your own writing. Okay, so if we move on to the next section. She was about 6'1" and had long frizzy blonde hair. She wore jeans and a shirt with a pair of high-heeled boots. Her face told me that I was in deep trouble. An outburst of rage left her mouth, entered my ears and left me motionless in fear. Their teacher had returned and now I was getting the blame for the mess the kids had created. The use of the pronoun she at the beginning of this particular section works nicely. It means that she remains nameless, and that creates a distance with the character from the reader. Here we have more evidence of comma splicing. She was about 6'1" and had long frizzy blonde hair. She wore jeans, which is making that sentence very disjointed. You know, you don't need to have a comma between blonde hair, she wore jeans, okay? As this section continues, we have an outburst of rage, which actually is a really effective description. And we can see in the next part where commas are used to control sentences. You know, the use of comma and punctuation itself can show a sophistication if used correctly, because you're controlling the way the reader reads that particular sentence. An outburst of rage left her mouth, entered my ears and left me motionless in fear. So that's where we can see evidence of a really nice controlled sentence. Here we have the final paragraph. I was sent to the head's office and he decided that I was not to come back to the school ever again and that I had failed in my work experience. But for me, I had learnt something. I knew from that moment that I was never going to be a teacher. That was my choice. The final paragraph feels a little bit rushed at the end. Something that you should always avoid is that phrase that you might have written into your stories when you were little, where you said, I woke up and it was all a dream. Anything like that, the examiner will just put their head in their hands and cry with despair. So please make sure that when you finish, try to end it in an effective way as well. It's a shame to rush it at the end, and that's why timing is very important, because you should be making sure that you divide your time all the way through, nice and controlled, so when you get to that final paragraph you can do it justice. And again at the end we have this comma splicing. If you recognise when you read through your writing at the end of the exam that you have used comma splicing and you've put commas where they shouldn't really be, all you need to do is just get your pen and just cross them out. It might make your booklet look a little bit messier, but at least you're not going to be marked down for the wrong punctuation use. We see here as well perhaps a tenuous link with the title. Sometimes students go into the exam, they have an idea of a story that they want to write, and no matter what the title is, they'll write that particular story. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but it's just worth noting that it is something that the examiner will pick you up on. So what were the strengths of this particular example? There was a nice narrow time frame, and we talked about how that's often quite effective. The paragraphs were very carefully organised, so this particular student knew what was going to happen in the beginning, the middle and the end. They knew what was the point of tension, and they didn't give a resolution for that particular problem, although I suppose it was them being sent on their way. There was a limited number of characters. We had this effective use of these temporal connectives, the time connectives. There were some attempts to describe, and there was consistent use of past tense. Past tense, I always think, works much better in stories. We had the first person, which you can use if you want to create a story where you draw the reader in. But I do always think, personally, that past tense always works better. So what could they have improved? They needed to include some dialogue. You don't want to have a story where it's he said, she said, he said, she said, but at the same time you do want to have a balance between prose and dialogue. There needed to be more detailed characterisation. Remember that we were introduced to that character Sam, and other than that he'd known or she had known that person since year 7, we didn't really have a great deal more detail about that particular character. So they would be marked down for that characterisation. And even the characterisation that we did see wasn't necessarily giving you a great amount of detail. There should have been perhaps greater ambition with vocabulary. I often have students who struggle with spelling say, do I use more ambitious vocabulary that I can't spell, or do I use more simple vocabulary that I can spell? Personally, I would say if because of the 50% for spelling, grammar and punctuation, I would be tempted to use words that you can spell. At the same time, what you can do, and it's especially important I think for dyslexic students, where if you learn a particular vocabulary list that is generic, that you can use in many different narrative stories, narrative writing, then I think that you'll find that very useful going into the exam. Try to vary your sentence structure. It is part of the mark scheme. So you're really missing a trick if you don't use a simple, a compound and a complex sentence all the way through your writing. It is something that they're looking for. Proofread your work very carefully. If you've used commas incorrectly, go through, cross them out. So make sure that you proofread it. Any words that you weren't sure of how to spell, use that time at the end of this particular exam to go back through and try those spellings again if you think that they are incorrect. Try to link very closely to the title that's set. I know that WJC have picked up on students preparing particular stories that they go into the exam and reproduce, which is something that they have said that they don't want to see. I can appreciate that there is, panic with that because you might struggle with spelling, so you think that perhaps preparing a story is going to help you. So I completely understand that. What you may want to do is just to prepare a few different narrative titles that perhaps can fit into the questions that are asked, so they are closely linked to the question set. And try to end strongly. I always say with a story you should have a strong beginning, a strong middle and a strong end. Okay, those should be your most important things that you focus on, because that's the areas of that particular story that will stick in the examiner's head. Okay, top tips or success criteria. Use the first person, past tense. Have a clear beginning, middle and ending. Try to keep to a short time frame. Write about what you know. Don't write any, I would really avoid any kind of dystopian fiction. You can see it on the next point. So avoid gratuitous violence or fantasy. Don't, under any circumstances, write about a night out, write about drinking, write about drugs. I'd avoid excessive violence. It is very difficult to write a story like that successfully, so just avoid it completely. Whereas if you write about something that you know and that you have experience of, you will just naturally write far better about that particular experience. Keep your story plausible, consistent and convincing. Set the scene effectively. Use descriptive techniques, but don't overdo it. You don't want it to be overwritten. Try to vary the verbs that you use. If you're going to use the word running, well, could you use a different verb instead? Would sprinting or something else work far better? Use small amounts of dialogue purposefully. You don't want to have, complete prose all the way through, but at the same time, you don't want to have like a list going back and forth between dialogue. Proofread your work very carefully. So check your spelling, your full stops, your capital letters, your vocabulary, etc. and try to be ambitious. So good luck with your preparation for your narrative writing. What I would advise you to do now is to go back, have a look at some of those question titles that you saw on the earlier slide and practice writing those particular narrative stories. It's a good idea as well to time yourselves doing that. In your exam you have 45 minutes to write your story, so it's worth spending say 5 to 8 minutes planning, then 30 minutes writing, and then 5 to 8 minutes at the end checking through. I think the checking, because of the 50% spelling, grammar and punctuation, is really, really important. You might in the past have just very quickly checked your story at the end, but because of that 50%, you must check it through very, very carefully. And if a sentence doesn't make sense, reword it. If it sounds, as you're reading it through, if it feels clumsy, it's because the grammar is incorrect and you need to reword it and check your expression. Avoid comma splicing, but really important at the end of the exam that you do proofread your work. And also, if anything, make sure you have capital for yourself, I, for the pronoun I, but also capital letters at the beginning of sentences, organised into paragraphs, and full stops. I sometimes have students say to me, I know the full stops go, but I can't be bothered to use them. You must use them. That, above, if anything, you use capital letters, full stops, and paragraphs. Really, really important, because if you don't, it's going to really be quite obvious for that examiner. And good luck.